Welcome to the Melanoma Research Foundation's Cure-OM Ask the Expert series. My name is Sarah Seelig. I'm the co-founder and director of the MRF's Cure-OM initiative. We are pleased to have you join us today for this educational opportunity entitled Centering the Patient Voice in Research. Our conversation today is to gain insights into how the ocular melanoma patient perspective can help physicians and researchers advance the field of research and treatment and development. Our mission at the MRF is to eradicate melanoma by accelerating research while educating to and advocating for the melanoma community. In November, the MRF's Cure-OM initiative creates awareness about ocular melanoma through our I Get Dilated campaign, encouraging awareness about eye health and the importance of getting a yearly dilated eye exam. While we don't yet know how to prevent ocular melanoma from occurring, it can be caught early. As we wrap up the I Get Dilated month, we hope you will schedule your dilated eye exam and participate in our I Get Dilated campaign to spread this critical awareness. We know that education is critical for patients making informed decisions about their care. We are grateful to Castle Biosciences for their generous support of this webinar series and their investment in the MRF's mission. Castle Biosciences offers diagnostic tests that provide actionable, tumor-specific information for improved treatment decisions and patient outcomes. A brief medical disclaimer before we get started. We encourage you to use the Q&A box to ask questions throughout this session. The information presented during today's session is for educational purposes only, and any individual treatment question should be directed to your healthcare provider. We encourage everyone to visit melanoma.org to learn more about the resources we have available. Also, this session will be available after as part of our videos on demand that you can share with others. It is now my pleasure to introduce Katharina Alsina from Castle Biosciences. Kat is an associate director of the uveal melanoma division at Castle Biosciences and will be introducing today's speakers. Kat?
Thank you so much, Dr. Seelig. It is my great pleasure to be introducing today's speakers. And first will be Dr. Seelig. So as she mentioned, she is the co-founder and director of the Melanoma Research Foundation's Cure-OM initiative. Founded in 2011 with her husband, Dr. Greg Strax, the Cure-OM initiative stands for the Community United for Research and Education of Ocular Melanoma. And the mission of the MRF's initiative is to increase awareness, education, and research funding for ocular melanoma while improving the lives of people affected by this disease. The Cure-OM initiative excels because of the hard work and dedication of its patients and scientific steering committees and the generosity of the community. Dr. Basil Williams is an ocular oncologist and vitreoretinal surgeon at the Bascom Palmer Eye Institute, where he completed his ophthalmology residency and vitreoretinal surgery fellowship and served as a chief resident and co-director of ocular trauma. Dr. Williams is extremely accomplished, and during his time in training, he was inducted into the Alpha Omega Alpha Honor Society and won the Fellow of the Year award. He completed an additional fellowship in ocular oncology at Wills Eye Hospital, where he received the William Tasman Outstanding Fellow Teaching Award. He grew up in the Bronx, New York, and received his Bachelor of Arts degree from Yale University. He then attended the Chicago Medical School, where he was elected to the Gold Humanism Honor Society. Prior to joining Bascom Palmer, where he is now, he was the director of ocular oncology at the University of Cincinnati and held the Mary Knight Asbury Endowed Chair of Ocular Oncology. And finally, Nigel Deacon is the co-founder of OcuMel Canada, an initiative of the Save Your Skin Foundation in Canada. He retired from a career in public education in 2012 when he was diagnosed with metastatic ocular melanoma, and he now devotes his time to improving outcomes for Canadian OM patients. And with that, I think we're going to turn things over to Dr. Seelig.
Thank you, Kat. I'm going to try and share my screen here. Okay, can you all see my slides?
Perfect.
Okay, great. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us. I'm going to start us off with just sort of an initial perspective, actually start with a personal perspective and lead us through Cure-OM and how patients are engaged, how we engage patients in the research process. So I thought I would start off with just a real personal perspective, and that when my husband, Greg, when he was diagnosed in 2006, really asked questions that challenged my assumptions of the hierarchy and sort of the approach to the medical field. And Greg was a psychologist by training, and a lot of his questions were along the lines of, why isn't the patient at the center of all that's happening? And a lot of the clinical trials Greg participated in, these were questions that he raised. And so when we founded the CureOM initiative, which has a tripartite mission, very similar to the MRF's overall mission, really the patient and the patient's family are at the core and the center of all we do. And I think that was largely because of Greg's vision and his questioning of the medical community at the time. And that has really, I think, changed my career and my approach to everything that I do in medicine, and for sure everything that we do through CureOM. Interestingly, since Greg was diagnosed in 2006, I think the medical field has shifted somewhat too. And, you know, it goes back to sort of the age-old statement, nothing about us without us. And I think that is really how Greg felt, and he didn't understand at the time some of the challenges he experienced from his perspective could be easily solved if only someone took the time to hear about the patient experience and the patient perspective. So there's a growing body of literature actually since that time when Greg was asking those questions. And I thought I would just briefly go through some of this. I think the medical field itself has shifted to embrace more of that perspective, that the patient experience really needs to be at the center of the medical field and of research. So just a few articles as examples. Here is an article out of the Netherlands embedding meaningful patient involvement in the process of proposal appraisal at the Dutch Cancer Center. And a quote from this article talks about the involvement of patients or their representatives in health research decision-making process on the basis of their experiential knowledge. So that's how they define meaningful patient involvement. And this article talks about their own experience engaging patients in proposal reviews. And then here is an article posing this question, asking about this experiential knowledge that we just heard the other group talk about. Is this a new research for biomedical, or a new resource for biomedical research? Well, I think patients would have answered the question, yes, a long time ago. And here the medical literature is following suit. And so here in this article, they talk about, well, what is this new resource? Well, patients, people with any type of experiential knowledge of disabilities or chronic diseases who are involved in health research can complement the expert knowledge of researchers in health professions. So starting to really define what does it mean to have that experiential knowledge and how can it serve the medical field. And then in 2010 in the US, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, or PCORI, was founded, and they require patient engagement for all of the research that they support. And they define patient engagement as meaningful involvement throughout the entire research process, from planning the study to conducting the study and disseminating study results. And so that takes sort of these earlier ideas that we just saw in the first two articles I showed, and it's expanding that really through the entire continuum of the research process. And then here is actually a 10-year report out from PCORI and Health Affairs just a couple years ago. And they looked at a number of different studies, most of them funded by PCORI itself, and came up with sort of the conclusion. Many articles reported that engagement provided valuable contributions to research feasibility, acceptability, rigor, and relevance. The findings suggest that engagement can support more relevant research through better alignment with patients' and clinicians' real-world needs and concerns. So this idea of real-world data, real-world needs really being integrated into research efforts has been evolving in the medical literature. And then lastly, this is just another example of findings. This is an international group that found the positive impacts identified enhance the quality and appropriateness of research, Impacts were reported for all stages of research, again, hearing that theme of engaging patients throughout the research continuum, including the development of user-focused research objectives, development of user-relevant research questions, development of user-friendly information, questionnaires and interview schedules, more appropriate recruitment strategies for studies, consumer-focused interpretation of data, and enhanced implementation and dissemination of study results. So this article goes, I think, even further into the details of ways in which patients and family members can be involved in research. And one last point is that this is actually gaining so much traction that it's not just in the clinical setting that patients are engaging in research, but this is an article actually talking about engaging patients in preclinical laboratory research and the importance and the feasibility of that. And we heard this just recently at the CureOM Science meeting, where we had patients and family members engaged. And we hear this from preclinical researchers that engaging with patients makes their work more meaningful and allows them to be more focused on outcomes that are important to patients. So both in the preclinical and clinical space, I think this focus on engaging patients and family members is really increasing. So as an advocacy organization, I think we play a critical role to engage patients and to connect patients and researchers. So I thought I would just go over a few ways that CureOM engages patients in the research process, and then I'll dive a little deeper into the last example that I'm going to give. One, funding research. So we know that many of you out there have made grassroots efforts and had fundraising efforts that have directly funded research grants that we have awarded through the MRF and CureOM, and we're grateful for that, and we couldn't be funding this research without you. Also advocating for research funding. So it's patients who have gone to the Department of Defense, the FDA, other entities, and advocated for more research for melanoma and the rare subtypes of melanoma, including ocular melanoma. Identifying research priorities. So we have a number of different ways that patients can engage both internally and externally on advisory boards to help create focus areas that are most important to patients for researchers to really hone in and narrow in on research priorities that are important to patients. We also engage patients and family members in reviewing our grant proposals. So we have a peer review process at the MRF for grant proposals when they come in. And we also, for several years now, have had patients and family members as part of the review process, again, making sure that patients and their perspective and their experience are at the center and the core of these research efforts. I just mentioned having patients and family members participate in scientific meetings, connecting that patient experience with the researchers in the discussions. Participating in advisory boards, different research efforts and surveys. So there are ongoing opportunities through CureOM in partnership with different researchers, as well as industry partners, where we pull advisory boards together. We have surveys. You'll hear a little more shortly from Dr. Williams about a shared effort that we had in this area. And then also as patient advocates in an ongoing way. So there are sort of one-time opportunities to be on an advisory board or fill out a survey. And then we also help connect researchers to patient advocates who can serve as advisors, again, across the continuum of a research effort from the very beginning to disseminating the results and implementing an intervention if it calls for that. And then, of course, participating in research. So participating in clinical trials. And so we at the MRF and CureOM feel it's very important to help educate patients about clinical trials and help connect patients to clinical trials for which they're eligible. And that is something that we do in a number of different ways. And then a year and a half ago, we launched a patient-reported registry. And this is what I wanted to spend a little bit of time on sharing with you. Many of you have heard about the Vision Registry. And this is a way that we can, we've engaged patients in what questions are meaningful, what are meaningful outcomes to know about. And then we're asking patients to report their own data. And so again, from the beginning, this has been a patient led effort. So VISION stands for Virtual Information System to Improve Outcomes and Networks. And VISION is really a tool, again, with the patient experience at the center. This was designed by patients, and the patients are reporting their own data, really allows us to connect all the different stakeholders within the ocular melanoma community with the hope of advancing research. So this is the landing page of VISION and our three main aims, and patients from anywhere in the world can come to this website and participate in VISION and share their information. And again, you'll hear more from Nigel, but he's actually a member of our VISION steering committee. So we pulled together a group of about 20 people, interdisciplinary group, including patients and caregivers, to help guide the development of VISION step by step, and now advise us in an ongoing way. Anyone in the world can, as I mentioned, come to the website and sign an online consent form. So this is carefully governed by an ethical review board. And then we ask patients to fill out a number of surveys in the registry. And I'm going to go through just a few of these outcomes that we've measured over the past year. We've recently published our first registry report, and you can access that online. I'm going to go through just a few initial data points, and then please visit our website and look at more of the data and engage with us today. So this was last May, so this was after 12 months of the registry being opened. We had a little over 300 patients registered. Now we have a little over 400 patients registered in VISION. And I just thought I would show these couple questions here because I think they're relevant to what we're discussing here today, which shows that the majority of patients are interested in being informed of research efforts and being involved in clinical trials. So we know patients are eager to be involved, and I think it's our job as an advocacy organization to continue to innovate and be creative about how to connect patients to the research efforts that will improve their lives. And clearly, patients are telling us that's of interest to them. So just quick examples of some baseline data that we've collected here. As you can see, the majority of patients have choroidal melanoma, which is to be expected by the epidemiology of this disease. And then you can see the breakdown of the years that patients were diagnosed, which I think just gives us kind of a foundation to understand their experience of what treatments were being offered at this time, and kind of the context with which to understand the answers that patients are giving us. And again, these data are just reflective of at this time, a little over 300 patients, now over 400 patients in the registry. And so we can't speak for the entire ocular melanoma community, but just speaking to the patients who have registered in our database. You can see the breakdown of age of patients in the registry, as well as the breakdown of sex. And then you can see the breakdown of where patients are currently living. And we're eager to get additional engagement of patients outside the United States, and are eager to engage patients in understanding how best to reach those patients. So we have a well-represented sample of patients. You can see the breakdown of race and ethnicity here as well. And while we know that this disease has a particular population, we also really want to understand sort of the rare subtypes within the uveal melanoma. And so we're eager to expand our pool of patients in the registry so we can understand everyone's experiences. And then a few questions I'll just go through just as examples, I think, of how patient-reported data can help guide our thinking and how we support patients. So we asked about financial considerations, if patients are insured or not. And even if they are insured, have they experienced any financial burdens that made receiving medical care difficult? I think here you can see the bulk of the patients in the registry right now do have insurance. We still have a subset of patients who have experienced financial hardship. And we are collecting qualitative data as well. So we have open text box where we are getting just patients can write in their thoughts. And so we are mining those data now to really understand, okay, well, out of those patients who did have financial considerations that made it difficult to receive the medical care they wanted, we want to go in and see, well, what were those considerations and how can we as an advocacy organization support that, or how can we advocate for change to better support patients so they're getting the care that they need. We also asked about biopsies of the primary tumor, and you'll hear more about this from Dr. Williams shortly in another kind of more in-depth analysis we did about biopsies. But in the registry, we do ask patients if they were offered a biopsy, and you can see 62% of patients were offered a biopsy. And then we ask, well, did patients, just because they were offered a biopsy, did they have one, and why or why not? And this helps us understand, again, how patients are thinking, what information they're given, what additional information or education patients may need to make informed decisions. And again, Dr. Williams will go into more detail shortly, but when you ask patients about regret, or if they would make that same decision again after they've lived through that, I think this is really important to understand. And what we find in the registry is that the patients who chose to have a biopsy were less likely to have regret about that decision, more likely to make the same decision again than were patients who decided against having a biopsy. And again, we'll go into more detail about this particular topic shortly, and I think the implications for care. And then just a couple more slides from Vision. We also ask patients both with primary disease and metastatic disease to rank the priorities that they are using when they're making decisions about their treatment. And I think this is really important for us to understand. And I think it will be interesting for us to understand this as we enroll more patients in Vision. But when we understand how and why patients are making the decisions they're making, we can better support their needs to be able to make the decisions that are best for themselves and their family. And you can see here, number one priority, long-term survival for patients with primary disease. I think some people have noticed that the overall quality of life is actually much lower on this priority list. So I think, for us to dive in to understand why these priorities are showing up the way they are is important as well as a follow-up and as a next step. And you'll see the same ranking for patients with metastatic disease in just a couple slides. And then we ask questions of patients like, how far did you travel to receive treatment? Again, understanding the patient experience can help us as an advocacy organization and help clinicians and payers understand how to support patients. And so understanding how far patients are traveling, what the financial burdens are. These are only things that patients can really tell us. We can't learn this from clinical charts. And then we ask those same patients of metastatic patients. So you'll see, again, this theme of long-term survival as a priority area stays at the top for patients with metastatic disease, and the overall quality of life is even a little bit lower in percentages. And on the left, what you see is the percentage of patients ranking that particular consideration number one. And on the right-hand side, you see the percentage of time that patients rank that particular consideration in their top three in terms of what's most important when they're making choices about their care. And then interestingly, as one might expect, when we ask patients with metastatic disease, how far do they travel to receive treatment? You see patients traveling farther distances. And so again, how can we better support patients to get the care that they need? And also, I don't show these data here, but we ask patients, were they participating in a clinical trial? And so if we want patients to participate more in research, including clinical trials, how can we make that possible? And really understanding the patient experience will help us address those issues. And then lastly, we ask a number of quality life questions in Vision. And this is just showing sort of the mean on this validated tool called FACT-G. And this is showing actually, interestingly, that of the patients who are currently in Vision, between primary disease and metastatic disease, the mean quality of life score on the FACT-G is relatively similar. Now we can go in and look at the different subsections and follow this over time, which I think will be very important to do, again, to really understand quality of life in the patient population and the different components that are contributing to this. So I think just to kind of wrap up my part in just a couple slides, these are just some very early data from Vision, which is one of the ways that we are engaging patients in research. We're continually trying to improve Vision and try to improve this tool for the patient community, both in the questions that we're asking and in using Vision as a tool to connect patients to research efforts. So we're eager for your feedback along the way. And just, I think, to bring it back to the personal perspective for me, again, why are we engaging patients in research? Why are we doing all of this? We're doing this to keep families intact, and so we can find a cure to this very challenging disease. And we'll only be able to do that hand in hand with all stakeholders, working together with patients really at the center and the core of that effort. So thank you for your time today. And I'll just thank the sponsors, the Vision, and encourage all of you to engage as you are able with Vision itself. And I will hand it over to you, Dr. Williams, to talk about another effort. Let me stop sharing. We had a shared effort that really dives into the patient experience a little more in your clinical area, and look forward to hearing more about that from you.
Yeah, thanks so much. So before we kind of dive into this, I want to say a couple of things. Dr. Seelig, I've had the pleasure of hearing you speak a few times, but it's really powerful every time I do. I think, not only your personal story and Greg's story, but kind of advocating for the role of patients in research and care is extremely important. And it's something that when I went into medicine, I knew, and I always thought of myself as somebody who paid close attention to that. And I think over the last few years, I've understood more how much I didn't know about that and how I'm continuing to learn. And so I'm going to try and be brief in my presentation because I think kind of amplifying your voice and Nigel's voice is really important in this experience. And I'll talk a little bit about a study that, as you mentioned, was a collaboration between the Melanoma Research Foundation and Castle Biosciences. And it was basically kind of asking patients with a history of uveal melanoma, understanding their perspectives on prognostic testing. And I will say that going into it, as we were developing questions and preparing this plan, I was kind of thinking, well, I think biopsy is important because it gives us a lot more information. And that was unfortunately the perspective that I had, right? And so hearing more and more about the testing and the patient's responses, I was able to process it more, not from the perspective of what I think is important, right? Using that parental kind of view of medicine that has been around historically, but truly understanding this is actually about not only what the patients want, but kind of how much I selfishly can get from the patients, from their experience, from their understanding, from their knowledge base, so I can provide the care that they need by kind of listening to them. And so I think that's something that I'm still improving on. And I think meetings like this and opportunities where we can listen to patients and family members of patients is really an educational process that's a two-way street, as you kind of mentioned, Dr. Seelig. So thank you for that. And so I would also like to thank my collaborators on this project. As you can see here, it was a wonderful team. So what did we do in this project? We basically went through the database of patients from the Melanoma Research Foundation and kind of reached out to see who was interested in participating in this study, where we sent a survey asking about expectations and what happened in prognostic testing. And so as you can see here, there were 177 patients that were included, and there's a little bit of a breakdown as to those who underwent the DecisionDx biopsy or testing with Castle Biosciences, whether they underwent other testing, whether they didn't have testing, or whether they didn't know. It is important to know that 6 patients did actually have DecisionDx biopsy or prognostic testing, but they included in the I don't know section. And there were 7 patients who were offered DecisionDx training but opted out. And so in that group, we did assess their decision regret. So here you can see the patients that participated in the survey, and you can see that over 70% of patients were women. And I think this was also represented in Dr. Selig's presentation with vision. And I think this is something that we have to think about as well. I think it's important to get this data, and we want to make sure it's as representative as possible. So when we kind of discuss these results, we will keep that in mind. We also look at where patients were, the time frame in which patients were diagnosed with melanoma, and about 70% of them or so were diagnosed within the last few years, between 2015 and 2020. There was a small group that was included from before that time, and we'll kind of take that into consideration when we think about some of the responses to the survey as well. So did people want prognostic information when diagnosed? And the answer was kind of a resounding yes. So a large percentage of people did want this possibility. And when there was a discussion of prognostic testing at the time that it was offered, we can see that there was a range of what tests were offered, with a little over 50% being offered the DecisionDx-UM. And there is a small group that did not know. And it's also interesting that there were some people in this, which Dr. Selig mentioned also, who were not offered prognostic testing. And I think we also, by kind of doing sessions like this and having more interaction with patients, we provide patients with the opportunity and resources to know about prognostic testing, and perhaps to have that conversation or bring that conversation up as a way to advocate for yourself as well. And so we can see the breakdown here of the types of testing that were performed. And now we'll go a little bit into what was concerning people about the molecular prognostic testing at the time of the decision. And you can see around 40% in both groups had concerns. Around 40% did not have any concerns at all. But among the most significant concerns were the cost of the test, and also the mental and emotional impact that the test would have. And so I think this is critical when we as physicians have this conversation, to kind of think about those things and potentially address some of those concerns in the beginning. And then you can see that particularly for the DecisionDx group, there was some concern about the actual procedure, the biopsy risk itself. And we don't quite know why that is in terms of timing, because a lot of these patients were in the 2018-2019 range. And so we know that's still a concern. But I think this is important for physicians to understand as well, so we can actually appropriately discuss what happens with the biopsy and kind of talk about the risks, thankfully quite low, but the risks of biopsy, so patients are well informed. And then we talk about how easy it was to understand the results after this testing had come back. And so you can see that patients who received or who underwent the DecisionDx testing or the alternative testing, the vast majority of patients found it very easy or somewhat easy to understand. And I think that's important. And when we look at DecisionDx training in particular, and we kind of divide it up by classes, we know that class 1A has the lowest risk of spread and class 2 has the highest risk of spread. Therefore, it's not quite surprising that in the group that felt it was very easy, it was much more patients in the class 1A that had a low risk of spread. Whereas patients who had a difficult or very difficult time understanding the results, they had a higher risk. So this kind of makes sense. And I think this helps prepare physicians also for the conversations to have with patients when the biopsy results come back, and kind of helping to guide patients along this path. In understanding the test results, I think it's also important kind of looking at a breakdown between the classes as to what patients felt about the doctor's ability to answer questions. So you can see that a lot of patients felt that all the questions were answered, and there was a small group that said the doctor was not able to answer any of the questions, which I think is a little bit concerning in some ways. And I think, you know, a little caveat, this is something that can be challenging for the patients and for the doctors as well. And so I think it's good for us to kind of understand that we're not always able to answer all of the questions, and we can kind of provide that information up front. And I think there are also other resources that are helpful for patients, including patient groups, where they can get information from other patients who have navigated this landscape and kind of experienced this. But one of the most important things to me here is that there were no patients that didn't have any questions. And that means that patients are really interested in knowing what's going on, and they have questions and they want to get answers to these things. And so I find that to be kind of one of the fundamental things as a physician, kind of to be have open ears and to kind of listen to what's going on with the patient, so that way we can try our best to answer those questions, or at least direct patients in a path that will help them get those answers as well. And then when we think about what's the value of these results for patients, so you can see that a lot of patients felt that it increased their knowledge and understanding, helped provide relief from uncertainty about the future, and also allowed patients to have some personalized treatment options in their decision-making process. And again, when we look at the breakdown of classes, in the DecisionDx testing, you can see that it increased the knowledge and understanding more so in patients who had a higher risk of disease, which isn't surprising, and more relief from uncertainty about the future in patients who had a lower risk. So again, this is something that I think kind of intuitively makes sense, but I think it is important for us to understand as well. And then we'll go over kind of one of the last things. There's this violin plot. And basically what this is showing is the range of patients all the way on the left with DecisionDx testing, in the middle with alternate testing, and then on the right, those that did not have testing. And we're assessing their decision regret about the testing, regardless of what class they were in. And you can see that whether they got DecisionDx testing or alternate testing, they did not have regret. And so the lower that kind of maroon dot is, the less regret they had. But you can see in the patients that did not have testing, they did have a higher amount of regret. And so that's something that we keep in mind as physicians about the potential for patients to have regret about not having the testing. And I think that's valuable from the perspective of the conversation we have when offering the test. Obviously, it's the patient's decision, but I think it's important for us to understand this in the conversation. And when we do a breakdown, you know, I think kind of intuitively, I had assumed that patients with a higher risk of spread might have more regret about having the decision, having the prognostic results. And you can actually see here that there's no difference whether they had a low risk with the class 1A or a high risk with class 2. And I think this is indicative that patients do like to have that information, and it may not be every patient, but a lot of patients do appreciate having this information, and this information is valuable without causing regret afterwards. And so this is something that also kind of sunk into me about the importance of providing the opportunity for patients to make this decision and to kind of think about the value that they find in it, even if there is a high risk of metastatic disease afterwards. And I think, you know, the combination of questions that patients have had also has also kind of helped guide my practice to give patients an opportunity not only to speak with me about the technical aspect of things, but also to speak to other people who are able to provide benefits in different ways. So perhaps counselors based on anxiety related to the biopsy results, and other resources as well, including other patients. So some of the take-home points that I got from this is patients want to be offered prognostic testing, and that does come along with some concerns. So I think it's important to be able to navigate that conversation well. Patients find the testing useful in a number of ways, so it may not be always just one way or the way that we think about it, or the way I thought about it as a physician. Patients do have questions and they want to be engaged in the decision-making process, and so it's important to take the time and effort to make sure the patients are involved and understand what's going on. And as evidenced by the earlier talk, and I'm sure by Nigel's talk as well afterwards, I'm continuously educated in these conversations as well. So there's a lot of mutual benefit. And then lastly, after the results, patients are unlikely to experience regret. And I think that's really, really important because we are providing valuable information, and it's something that patients want to have and don't regret having afterwards. And so I think I learned a lot in this process, and I think it does help make me a better physician and take care of patients in a better way. And I'm looking forward to continued conversations and discussions and research opportunities similar to this in the future, so that way I can continue to learn more and provide the kind of care that the patients are asking for and need. So thanks for the opportunity to speak and share some of the data that, that we put together. And then I think at this, oh yes, go ahead.
I was going to say thank you so much, Dr. Williams. And Nigel, would love to pass the mic over to you to bring this all together from your perspective as a patient and advocate, founder of Ocumel Canada, and love to hear your own perspective and where you see this all going.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm not sure that I see where it's going, but I'm certainly enjoying the ride. Lovely to meet Dr. Williams for the first time, and thank you for introducing me to violin plots. I absolutely love them, and I see great potential for decorating my house and my life with. Just a little bit more personal information before I show some slides that I thought would help me explain some of my thinking to you. I live with ocular melanoma. I was diagnosed in 2010, which is 12 and a half years ago now. And obviously, the molecular testing was in its infancy. I think Castle Biosciences had just become active the previous year in 2009. And the first time I was told about the possibility of having testing done on my eye tumor was as I woke up from brachytherapy. So it was a missed opportunity, and I think perhaps deliberately pitched that way. And I was also given an article by a very well-known physician in the States saying that it's better not to have the information that comes from the testing because nothing can be done to help patients who develop metastasis. So you see how far we've come. We're talking in much more hopeful terms about patients and how they live with the disease. I did develop metastasis just under the 2-year mark in March 2012. I had a good deal of immunotherapy in 4 years, one after the other, and eventually got to really quite a good place in combination with radiation. And so I had a PET scan on Thursday of last week, which confirmed that my cancer is still sleeping, which is a lovely thing to hear. And I had a meeting with the radiation oncologist on Friday, the following day. I got the report in my hands, and I met with my general oncologist yesterday. So, despite the fact that we've just been through a pandemic and the medical system has been stressed beyond belief, I feel that my care has been excellent, and I have seen nothing but compassion and love from all of those who've helped me to get to where I am here. So I have no negative feelings about those who have helped me to become a well person. I fairly quickly decided that I would try to get in touch with organizations that brought patients together, and there weren't any in Canada. So I had to go to the States, and I very quickly came across Cure OM, which was in its infancy at that time as well. And I've stayed in close touch, ever closer touch, I think. I've learned so much from what they've been able to do in their space. And I've been inspired to replicate some of that up here in Canada. We're certainly behind, but we have lots of time to catch up. What we have been able to do is connect patients, reach a lot of Canadian patients. And for me, that's been the most exciting thing, I think, on this journey so far. I do serve on 2 of the CURE-OM committees. Sarah referred to one of those, and I feel I have a wonderful opportunity to give back because I have survived so long. I'm now going to try and share my screen, so wish me luck. Is that looking okay?
Yes, we can see your slides.
When I think about getting to the cure, which is of course what we all want, doctors and patients and caregivers, I see it as a puzzle, a jigsaw puzzle, and we have not yet even figured out what or to find new pieces as we go along and as we try to fit them together. I think these pieces we know. And as Sarah introduced the session, I remembered how incredibly excited I was in 2017 to learn that CURE-OM, under the leadership of Sarah, had been incredibly successful in getting ocular melanoma into the Cancer Genome Atlas. And to me, that still is the largest triumph, I think, that we've had, because that's when we really started to understand the complexity of the disease with more clarity. We began to think of different groups of patients with different needs, and for whom different treatments might work better. So that would fit into the science piece of the puzzle. When and just to say too that work on ocular melanoma for the Genomic Atlas was done very, very quickly. Most cancers had a 5-year window to get all of their samples and their data, and Sarah had 6 months to get it in under the wire. And so one of the outcomes from that, of course, is that we had a really clear notion that one of our challenges in ocular melanoma is that there are so few mutations. And because there are fewer mutations, immunotherapy doesn't work as well, and there are fewer targets for treatments to aim at. And so I just want to comment a little bit about statistics on my way through. When we read the scientific articles, it's very common for them to guess at the number of new diagnoses in the States. And so you'll see, I have seen anything ranging from 1,500 new diagnoses a year to 4,500. And I think that everybody guesses because we simply don't know. Nobody has counted. And it seems to me as a patient that with a rare disease, in a way, it should be easier to count because there's a lot less counting to do. The numbers will be smaller. And, you know, if you think of Britain with its population of 67 million, and its 4 treatment centers, it should be very easy to count there. You're dealing with 4 institutions. All of the data could very easily be collated, especially in this time of technological progress. Canada has a much smaller population, 37 million. We also have 4 treatment centers, so we do have that advantage. If we worked as teams, And this is something that Sarah and Greg thought a lot about and talked a lot about very early in setting up CureOM. If people work together, the outcomes will always be better. And so if we work together on statistics in the States, Canada, and elsewhere in the world, I think we would get a lot of information that's very useful to us, and we would build a much better picture of whether numbers are increasing. We think they're not, but it would be very nice to know. It would also be very interesting to know whether age at diagnosis is changing over time. We think of it as a disease of older people, but perhaps with better detection. And we're just ending our November campaign for I Get Dilated, and perhaps early detection lowers that over time. Sorry, we're jumping a little bit. And so Sarah has given us some wonderful information about the Vision Registry. I'm very excited about it because it gives me the opportunity, for example, I need to go back in now and upload my PET scan report from last week. So it's a wonderful place for me to keep the record of how my disease has changed over time. And it also makes it available to people in the future who, for one reason or other, might need to go in and study that for larger numbers of patients. I love that the reach of the Vision Registry is international. And currently, obviously, there's the disadvantage of it just being available in English. And I know over time that it will be translated into other languages. That's a matter of finding funding and finding time, but it will happen. And then it will be open basically to any ocular melanoma patient anywhere in the world to register. And you've seen the sophistication of the data analysis. We can immediately see where patients are. And I think that that will be very helpful to us too. The most important thing about it is that it records the progress of the disease. So it gives us a picture over time. It's a longitudinal study. And I think that will help us too. We anticipate, of course, there'll be changes and improvements and refinements over time. The flexibility is built in. There's the opportunity to add new surveys at any time. So that's the day that is coming for us as we get closer to the cure. And this year has been another incredibly exciting year for us, with the arrival of the first FDA-approved treatment for metastatic disease in February, I think it was. And in June, Health Canada also approved it. So we have lots of Canadian patients on that first available treatment. And that leads me to maybe my final point. And it is that I've seen patients develop more confidence and more courage as we've gone along. And so they are in a better position to ask questions, sometimes difficult questions. An example would be this new first approved treatment requires that you have a specific HLA type. And half of those who are tested have it and the other half doesn't. So it seems to me a reasonable question for those who don't have it to ask why there can't be new versions of the treatment for other HLA types. And it may be that, we completely misunderstand or we don't have enough information, but we have the greatest interest in expanding access to the treatment. And it seems that the HLA type is a vehicle for the treatment, and there might be other vehicles possible. So that's what I wanted to say. Thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity.
Thank you so much, Nigel, and Dr. Williams for joining us today. I think we have a few minutes for questions, and I have a question sort of on my mind that maybe I'll pose to you, Nigel, first, and then Basil, to you, which is, what do you see? I mean, I think we've talked a lot about the benefits of engaging patients from a number of different perspectives and across the continuum of research efforts. What do you see as some of the barriers to accomplishing that? You know, the barriers might be different at different points along that continuum, but maybe Nigel, to you first, and Basil, to you after that, some thoughts about barriers, and maybe if you have any thoughts about how to overcome some of those barriers.
Okay, it was so interesting. I hadn't really thought much about this until this morning. I've been vaguely aware of it, but in the responses to surveys, etc., Dr. Williams pointed out that, you know, there's a much lower response rate from men than from women. And we saw when Sarah showed how many people had registered already in the Vision Registry, a huge disparity. So that would be a really good place to start. We could, you know, we could say very quickly, well, you know, women have a different approach, they're more likely to become involved, etc. But I think we, you know, that's one barrier that we need to think quickly and creatively about. How do we make it easier for men to come forward and provide their information and to be involved? I don't see, Sarah, the same dichotomy when we meet in person. That's not my impression from the symposia. And so it may be an artifact of the difference between meeting in person and, you know, committing information to paper.
So I think that's a fantastic question, and that is something that I wrestle with on a regular basis when seeing patients. So I think for the perspective of the difference in responses in gender, I think it is very interesting kind of listening to Nigel's point about when people are in person, people are, there does not seem to be that level of a difference. And I'm not sure if it's the activation required to come to a meeting means that you're more likely to be engaged. But I do notice anecdotally a little bit of a difference in terms of interacting with men and women patients. Now, this is obviously vast generalizations, and there are a lot of differences individually. But the level to which women are willing to communicate about their situation and the difficulties they're having seems to be much higher than men, at least initially. And maybe this is true of communication styles and various other things. But I think kind of to Nigel's point, kind of being creative in the way that we ask for information or perhaps engage the patients in this would be something that's helpful, and perhaps upfront providing opportunities or reasons why there is some benefit to engaging in these things, or kind of giving concrete ways where it can be beneficial to the patient individually might be able to provide a little bit more of an incentive to participate. And I do know that in terms of that active engagement, one of the things that I find most challenging in the beginning is some level of either denial or discomfort with the diagnosis, and therefore not wanting to engage in what that means. And so my general approach in that situation is to provide as much information as it seems like will be handled at that time, and then kind of revisit the conversation continually over time, so that as people have more time to process that information, then perhaps more of it, we can have a more engaging conversation. But that's kind of one of my approaches anyway up front.
I think that's super helpful. I'm going to add one point to the two really good points that you both made from the patient advocacy space. Again, just thinking about challenges and maybe just flipping the perspective slightly, which is that I also think, like, as a patient advocacy organization, one of our obligations is to help the connecting. So again, connecting patients and family members with researchers and clinicians, and not just sort of connecting and have a nice day, but actually helping researchers and clinicians on their end understand how to engage patients, and not just like how technically, like, okay, we're going to send a survey out, but what does meaningful engagement look like, and helping researchers understand that it isn't a barrier to research, it's actually a facilitator of better research. Because I think in my experience, sometimes there's a preconceived notion, and Basil, you spoke to this earlier in terms of your perspective. I've experienced this from my own experiences in the medical field and wearing that hat rather than the caregiver hat, where there's sort of a sense of like this paternalistic perspective of I know best as the clinician, and that having more patients involved could sometimes be a barrier to getting research done quickly, or et cetera, et cetera. But I think what we're seeing time and time again from a number of different perspectives is actually engaging patients facilitates better research in many, many ways, more meaningful across the board. And so how can we help researchers understand how to implement meaningful engagement? And I think that's up to us as an advocacy organization, partnering with patients to really do that better. And I think this partnership with you all on this study is one avenue into that. I think we all learned a lot. And I think, and that and vision and other efforts, every time we do this, hopefully we'll get better at that piece of it too.
Yeah.
It's a learning process for all of us across the board.
Absolutely.
Were there other questions?
I do not believe so. I know we're a little over time already, so if we want to move on to closing remarks, I think that sounds great.
Okay, great. And I think Eric put in the chat that we're happy to take questions afterwards and can respond afterwards. And I will mention in my closing comments also another opportunity to ask questions and to continue this conversation. But first, I just want to thank Dr. Williams and Nigel so much for joining us today. Thank you for taking the time, sharing your thoughts, and just being such thoughtful and dedicated members of the ocular melanoma community. I want to thank Castle Biosciences for their generous support of our Ask the Expert webinar series. And just remind all of you that this program will be available on demand on our learning platform. And I think the link is in the chat. And it's also streamed to our social media channels, which you can find, I think, in the coming days. And also, I just want to make sure that everyone's aware of our upcoming patient and caregiver in-person meeting, where Dr. Williams and others will be joining us live in Tampa, Florida, March 31st to April 2nd. This is a partnership with Moffitt, and this will be our 2023 Eyes on a Cure Ocular Melanoma Patient and Caregiver Symposium. We have a link to registration in the chat. Hopefully you've received emails from us. There's information on our website and on social media as well. And I think that will be a great place to continue these conversations. I think there will be opportunities for patients to engage along the lines of what we've discussed here today. So really looking forward to seeing hopefully many of you in person in the spring. And then just a reminder to please visit melanoma.org, cureom.org to learn more about our upcoming webinars and other resources, educational opportunities that may be helpful to you. And please follow and visit the MRF's CureOM social media during what's left of November to engage in our I Get Dilated campaign. And just a huge thank you to everyone for joining us today.